Oh, hi. Glad you're here. I'm glad to be with you. Um, well, let me tell you a little story. I love Dune. I love Dune. I love Dune. I discovered Dune. Okay, full disclosure, I have never read the books. Sorry. But I discovered Dune in what was it, the late 90s, maybe year 2000, somewhere around there. When the Sci-Fi Channel did their miniseries, and I was all into Sci-Fi Channel miniseries, and so, I wanted to check that out, and it blew me away. I didn't really grasp everything about it, I just knew that it was awesome. So I loved the original Dune Sci-Fi Channel miniseries, and I loved its sequel, Children of Dune, with an all-star cast in both. Um, and then one day I saw the David Lynch version, and I was like, well, that was weird, but whatever. But then we got Denis Villeneuve, who I was a fan. I love Enemy, love Sicario. Arrival is one of my favorite sci-fi films of all time. Blade Runner 2049 is the only Villeneuve movie that I'm like, meh. I know, crazy, right? I love everything about that movie, don't get me wrong. It's a masterpiece. It's just the story. I can't stand that story. Too predictable and simple and wasted opportunity. Anyway, but the fact that earned him, well, I thought that earned him and got him Dune, but apparently I just heard in an interview of his that they offered him Dune before, it was after Sicario, before Arrival. And he said, no, 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 I need to practice in that genre first. So he did Arrival and Blade Runner just to practice before doing Dune. And then it's funny because he did Blade Runner, a sequel to a Ridley Scott film, where Ridley Scott was originally going to do a Dune movie that he didn't do. But Blade Runner has the lady who was in Lynch's Dune, and when Ridley Scott was going to do a Dune, he was going to have Hans Zimmer do the music, and Hans Zimmer got some temporary music with Pink Floyd's song as a test, and then the movie didn't happen, so he then used that song for the first trailer for Villeneuve's Dune. Whew, okay, what were we talking about? Oh, right, I was going to review Dune Part 2. So, needless to say, I was a big fan of Dune, and then I saw Part 1, and it blew me away, and I was like, when I first saw Part 1, I'm not going to lie, I was like, oh, okay, that was pretty cool. That was pretty good. I have now seen Part 1 31 times, and every single time I saw it, that second time, it was better. Third time, better. Fourth, every single time out of those 31 times I've seen Dune Part 1, it's gotten better. I've noticed something different. I've noticed something new. I've noticed what a masterpiece it is. Dune Part 1 is one of the greatest movies ever made. I've been counting down for Dune Part 2. Dune Part 2 is the only thing... I grew up a Star Wars nerd, and Dune Part 2 is the only thing I've been this excited about, other than Star Wars. Speaking of Star Wars, I was counting down for over 700 days to Dune Part 2. I was heartbroken when they pushed it back, and then thrilled when they pushed it up a week, and then I threw a freaking party when I found out I got to see the movie 4 days early in the IMAX. Anyway, so speaking of Star Wars, watching this movie was like what it must have been like in 1977 when people saw Star Wars projected on the screen. It's like, what? What am I seeing? I didn't know this was possible in film. I'm feeling and experiencing things I've never felt and experienced before. I have seen thousands of movies. Thousands. Only a dozen of them or less have ever made me cry. And it's usually because of one thing or because of one part or what have you. Dune Part 2 was the first movie I've ever seen that made me weep multiple times in one film. I was teary-eyed through probably half the film because I was so overwhelmed. But there were moments, one moment in particular, which I'll discuss, but another moment that made tears run down my face simply because I was in awe. I didn't know how my internal self couldn't express what it was feeling, and it just had to let something out because I was just literally blown away by what I was witnessing. Okay, so this is a spoiler review. I am going to go over specific details about Dune Part 2 that will spoil the experience if you haven't seen it. I don't care if you're planning on seeing it. I don't care or I don't care if you're not planning on seeing it. I don't care if you don't care about spoilers because you read the book or this and that. Oh, there's a lot of changes from the book. So I've heard. Don't watch this unless you've seen Dune Part 2. Because knowing these things will slightly ruin your experience. I mean, it'll still be amazing, but I highly recommend going in fresh to Dune Part 2. Whether you plan on seeing it or not, whether you've read the book or not, don't watch any spoilers until after you've seen the movie. Okay, so spoiler alert, spoiler alert, spoiler alert. When that movie opened with I immediately like got emotional. I'm like, oh my god, I can't believe we're doing this. Here we go. I think the line was power over spices, power over everything, something like that. But when it did that thing, like the screen went like negative black. I swear, I felt transported, like I wasn't in that movie theater anymore. It's funny, they showed the Dune 2 trailer twice right before we watched Dune Part 2. Anyway, so that starts, and then the music kicks in, and it's the same drum beats as Part 1, only different. So I started noticing some similarities. I was like, okay. And then it opens with Princess Illyron, whatever, given the voiceover to catch us up to speed. And I'm like, okay, just like Part 1. And then the first shot of the story we see is Chani and Paul on the side of a dune, hiding, getting ready for battle. Just like Chani and Jamis in Part 1. And then by the time we got to Lady Jessica drinking the water of life, and I noticed the music being the same, only different, from the Gamjaba box test scene in Part 1. And that's when it hit me. This film, Part 2, is a perfect mirror image of Part 1. I am so thankful that it was split into two parts because I've never seen a Part 2 told in this way that not just complements Part 1, but balances it out. It's two sides of the same coin. I'll throw out some examples here. Spoiler alert. Okay, so again, both movies open with the only different. Both movies have the same music themes, only tweaked. Hans Zimmer is a freaking genius. This is one of the greatest scores I've ever heard in my life. He has cemented himself as the third greatest composer in film history. Obviously, John Williams is number one and Danny Elfman is number two. Then you get the voiceover. Then you cut to the dune. The first and the last shot of the movie is just like the first one. The first film ends with Chani saying that line, and we have that shot of Chani, and then we cut to Lady Jessica, and it ends on Lady Jessica. Part 2 does the exact opposite. We've got Lady Jessica's line of dialogue, cameras on her, cut to Chani. Looking back, pretty much the same shot from Part 1, the end. And Chani is doing that thing, getting ready to ride a sandworm, very much just like Professor Kynes in Part 1. Yeah. I mean, the music, it's unbelievable how this matches Part 1 so well. It's like the whole Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon, Wizard of Oz thing. I don't know if you're familiar, but if you listen to Pink Floyd's album Dark Side of the Moon while watching The Wizard of Oz, the music matches up with the imagery in the film. I still gotta try that. I'm going to now. But I so badly want to watch Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2 at the same time and see how they match up with the story beats, with the themes, with the music. It's brilliant symmetry, and I love symmetry. So yeah, like I said, Jessica doing the Water of Life is just like, and around the same time, as far as runtime, when Paul does the Gamjabar box test. Okay? The Baron. Both films have Naked Baron. Both films have Baron in Oily Bath, which I still think is his own blood. Because they have black blood. Well, at least he does, according to my Lego set. Anyway, so yeah, you've got that. Both films end with Paul having to fight one-on-one duel to the death, which made me go, that's why Villeneuve was like, this is the perfect place to end part one. People have been debating for 3 years. Oh, well, you should have ended part one a little earlier, or you should have ended part one a little later, you know, or maybe you should have given him his name and then ended part one. No, he ended part one after the Jamis duel, so that part two can end with the Fade duel. Ugh. Ugh. And even reminiscent of when Duncan dies, he first pulls that sword out of him. So Duncan dies after pulling a sword out of him. Paul also has to pull the knife out of him, only he lives. And then you've got the fact that Paul's father tried to kill the Baron, failed, and died. Paul tries to kill the Baron, succeeds, and lives. And I'm sure I will come up with a billion more examples every time I watch this film, because I'm going to see it at least 30 more times in theaters. Yeah, that's right. I got to catch up with part one, so that when I watch them both back to back, will be each of their equal 30-second viewing, and then my 33rd viewing will be both of them at the same time. Oh, you better believe it. Luckily, I'm fortunate enough to be a manager at a movie theater, so I have access to watching Dune as much as I want, before and after hours. Otherwise, I never would have been able to afford it. My record right now is, back in 1999, I saw Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, in theaters 22 times. Okay, 19, and then I saw it 3 more times during its 3D re-release, and now that it's getting re-released again, I'm going to see it more. So we'll see which retains the record. Star Wars or Dune? But Star Wars was like my thing growing up as a kid, my whole life. Dune feels like, now that I'm 40, Dune is my adult Star Wars. Love it. Even though, yes, I'm well aware that Dune inspired everything that's in Star Wars. Star Wars took so much from Dune. Why wouldn't you take everything from Dune? Because Dune's amazing. So this film was an exhilarating emotional experience for me. It was everything I wanted and more. And I say that because it was literally everything I wanted and more. There were, I mean, especially that last, there wasn't as much action as I was expecting. Like, the first 2/3 of the movie are very character development, very quiet, very which I loved. I absolutely loved. I was not bored once. Those 2 hours and 46 minutes flew by for me, and I mean flew by. There was never a dull moment, even though there was a lot of quiet moments. The Getty Prime stuff, like, not just the arena, but like the entire time we were on Getty Prime, oh my gosh, I was blown away. Those goopy fireworks? What the heck was that? I was like, I have never seen anything like this. Denis Villeneuve is a freaking genius when it comes to sci-fi ideas and design. There was the other thing with the mines on Arrakis. These things start coming out of the sand and flying toward the thing and latch onto it and explode. I was like, what the heck was that? Oh, there's mines. I was like, mines? That's a really freaking cool idea. Okay, so then you got Getty Prime. Like, there were so many design like things I'd never seen or thought of or thought my brain would ever comprehend witnessing in my lifetime. Amazing. But the Getty Prime stuff, with the goopy fireworks, with the black sun, with the fight, with the music. Yes, Fade was fantastic. Oh, Leia Sadu was fantastic. I'm freaking out. I saw this movie 3 days ago, and I've been itching to see it again, and I have to wait till tomorrow morning to see it again. And I want to see it again so bad. But I can't stop thinking about it. No movie that I've been excited for have I thought more about after seeing it than before. Like this. Like, I was thinking about this movie nonstop for 3 years. But now having seen it, like, I can't stop. I've been listening to the soundtrack nonstop. I can't stop thinking. I had to talk about it. Thanks for joining me. If you're still here, great to have you, because now I have the 2 most important things to talk about. So the movie's amazing. Everything about it's amazing. I would give the Oscars to every single department. Every single department did the best thing I've ever seen. This is one of the greatest movies ever made, period, the end. There's no doubt about it. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. Any change they made from the book, from the research I've done, I completely approve of and think is absolutely fantastic. I knew, because she was at the premiere, that Anya Taylor-Joy was going to be there, and I suspected, well, The only way that makes sense is if she's playing his sister in a future vision because they know that she's going to be in part 3. Sure enough, that's what it was, which I was glad about. The two things that I had spoiled, if you will, was the fact that Anya Taylor-Joy was playing this. Well, I didn't know for a fact that she was playing the sister, but it was pretty obvious. But it went down exactly the way I imagined. But that's okay because I don't really like her too much. So if I didn't know that going in, I probably would have seen the big reveal and been like, oh, it's her, ew, gross, and it would have taken me out of it. So I'm glad I had a warning. And then the other thing was somebody interviewing Josh Brolin actually brought up the whole him versus Rabba fight. And he just casually goes, yeah, 3 moves and it's done. Ha ha ha. How awesome. And I was like, oh, well, thanks for spoiling that big moment. Well, now that I think about it, I'm glad I had a heads up because in that moment, I would have been pumped for a huge duke out, and then he just takes him out, and I would have been like, oh, I would have been, slightly underwhelmed and disappointed. But because I was expecting it, it was an awesome moment because he's getting his revenge. And looking back, of course it would only last 3 moves because Gurney is a way better fighter than Rabba, and Rabba's a coward, as we saw. So yeah, he would take him out immediately. If they had a big duel, it wouldn't make sense because Gurney's a way better fighter. Anyway. So I knew those 2 things going into it. But there was 2 other things. For 3 freaking years, I've been begging for a chance. When I saw Dune Part 1, we get these glimpses of Jamis. And he says one of the greatest lines, not just in cinema history, but I think ever written by any human being. And they're words to live by. The mystery of life isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to experience. A process that cannot be understood by stopping it. We must move with the flow of the process. We must join it. We must flow with it. So get to know Jamis as our instructor, our tutor, and our best friend before we actually meet him in part 1 was very impactful to me. And then we meet him at the end, and he's an a-hole. And we're like, okay, but he's just an a-hole in that moment. If we would have gotten to know him after that moment, we would have said, okay, well, he was just doing his thing. He's a very prideful, by-the-book kind of guy. He had every right to challenge Paul to that duel. But he lost. Because Paul could see his moves in the future. But I can't remember things. So Jamis is my favorite character of Dune. He has been ever since I saw that movie. Jamis is my favorite. So I was devastated by his death. Always am. I've seen his death 31 times, and it breaks my freaking heart every time. Same with the Duke. But Jamis dying in part 1, I kept thinking, but maybe there's some cutting room floor. I don't know if he filmed this after the fact or if it was filmed. It looked like it was more recently filmed because he didn't look exactly the same as he did in part 1. But at the time, for 3 years, I was thinking maybe there's little things of Jamis that he didn't use that he could use in part 2. Because even though Jamis is dead, we still have visions of possible futures that didn't come to be. So maybe we could still have another vision of Jamis, and he could be in part 2. And I kept hoping and rooting. Oh man, if only Jamis was in part 2, that would be the greatest thing ever. Okay? But I figured that's impossible and it's never going to happen. It's like asking for a unicorn for Christmas. I just want a unicorn for Christmas, please. But you know deep down it's not going to happen because it's impossible because unicorns don't exist. And then Christmas morning comes and you get a unicorn for Christmas. That's how it felt. First, Paul brings up Jamis. And I was like, oh, respect. Well, no, first we see his body at the beginning of the movie, and his body kind of has to do with the story, it's a distraction kind of. Okay, then we get to the siege, and everybody's talking about Jamis. Sorry, I've been mispronouncing it for 3 years, so I'm trying to get that out of my head. Everybody's like, Jamis, you killed Jamis, oh my gosh. I'm like, okay, we're making Jamis a big deal. And then they said that horrifying shot of sucking the water out of his body. Oh, I'm like, okay, so Jamis is important, still great. I'll take it. But then Paul starts bringing him up later, and I'm like, okay, here we go. And then when Paul's doing his walk and he sees Chani, but we hear Jamis laugh, and I was like, are we doing... Oh, darn it, it's Chani. Ugh, that would have been cool if it was Jamis. But then later, is it when he drinks the water of life? I think it might have been when he drinks the water of life. It's around that part. And he's calling out to Jamis. He says, I need to talk to Jamis. And I could feel that it was about to happen. And I grabbed my son. I was freaking out. And then when I saw Jamis, I'm going to get emotional just thinking about it. I immediately bawled. I wept like a baby. I was like, of happiness, like, oh my God, I'm getting what I wanted. I'm getting the one thing I wanted. And there he was. And not only that, but again, we're seeing Jamis in a vision around the same part of the runtime as we did in part one. And again, he has profound dialogue that puts Paul on the path he needs to be. Another great thing about it was something about you need, if you want to see the most, you have to be on the highest dune. And I interpreted it as the more control and access you want to have, the higher you're going to have to go, which means the more work to get there. Jamis was in this movie, and whew, man, this was a very, very overwhelming film. And like to have the big payoff be my favorite part of the movie was when Paul does this, and Christopher Walken's like, yeah, whatever, and then Paul just stomps his foot. He doesn't say something angry. He doesn't say get on your knees or kiss it or He just stomps his foot like a teenage boy with anger. And Christopher Walken, that poor sweet old man, has to get on his knees. And he goes to kiss the ring. I'll have to verify on my second viewing. But I could swear that he comes within like a millimeter, but he doesn't actually put his lips on it. I don't know. Kind of a jerk move. But anyway, so this movie is amazing and I love everything about it. And it didn't just meet my expectations, it exceeded my expectations. It's a masterpiece. It's funny, I use that word about a lot of movies, but now that word has been redefined for me. Like, this is what a masterpiece is. This changed cinema forever. And the fact, okay, so I was begging for part 2 when part 1 came out, and it was, I believe, the Monday or Tuesday after opening weekend that they announced part 2. And we now know that they greenlit part 2 long before part 1 came out. They knew they were making part 2. I bet you months ago, they greenlit part 3. They know damn well that they are making Dune Messiah. I predict that they will announce that either Monday or Tuesday, because Dune Part 2 is going to have a huge opening weekend, and it's going to be a huge success, and everyone's going to love it, and everyone's going to see it 30 times like me, and it's going to make $1 billion. There's no question in my mind that there was going to be a Dune Messiah. But when this movie ended, I was like, oh, okay, there's going to be a Dune Messiah. Because they're literally huge cliffhanger setting up part 3. Without a doubt. The Holy War has begun. And it's funny because this movie to me felt a lot like, people bring up Empire Strikes Back. I get that now. It's because it's that kind of middle part. It's clearly a middle part. And they're going into the big payoff. But to me, it felt like episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Where it ends with the beginning of a war. And then we're going to have the payoff in part 3, which is funny, because episode 2, Count Dooku's last line, well, not last line, but Count Dooku says near the end of that film, this is only the beginning, which is what Chani says at the end of Dune Part 1. And is that the last line of the film? I think the last line of episode 2 is actually Yoda saying, begun the Clone Wars have. And I'm pretty sure it's one of the last lines. It might be the last line when Lady Jessica in Dune Part 2 says, the Holy War has begun. So yeah, bring on the Holy War. Dune Messiah is going to be amazing, but there's no question in my mind, 120% they have already greenlit Dune Messiah. We will be getting Dune Messiah in the next 3 to 4 years. I guarantee it. Guarantee it. And I can't wait. It's going to be amazing. That's why they cast Anya Taylor-Joy. That's why they cast Christopher Walken. That's why they cast Léa Seydoux. That's why they cast Florence Pugh. Because just like a couple of people had teeny tiny parts in part one and then huge parts in part two, these people have teeny tiny parts in part two, but are going to have huge parts in part three. Now, so having said that, oh, Shiza, can you believe it? I was doing so well. Sorry about that, some technical difficulties. Anyway, I'm almost done. Let's wrap this up, okay? Here we go. So, another big piece of payoff was the fact that it occurred to me months ago there was going to be a part three. There's no doubt. But for the last few weeks, it dawned on me, and I kept joking. Part one ends with Zendaya saying the last line of the film, which is, "This is only the beginning." So I kept joking that part two should end with Zendaya saying the last line of, "This is only the middle." I thought I was clever and funny, and ha 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 ha, wouldn't that be hilarious? Obviously that's not going to happen because that would be silly. Imagine my shock and awe when this happened while in real time while watching the movie. She says this, and immediately a light bulb went over my head, and I went, is that going to be her last line? It's not the last line of the film, because there's a little bit left in the movie, but she doesn't say anything for the rest of the film. It is indeed her last line. Zendaya's last line of part two is, "This isn't the end." So I even got that! Oh, this movie's a freaking masterpiece. It's a mirror image of part one. They go hand in hand. It didn't just make part one better. It didn't just elevate it. It made them both intertwined. It's a freaking masterpiece, and I love it, and I'm glad I saw it in the IMAX. If you are anywhere near an IMAX, I had to pay $50 freaking dollars for an Uber to get home, but it was worth it to see in the IMAX. Luckily, I have access to a Dolby theater, so I'll be seeing all my other viewings in there with the fantastic sound. But for the visuals, see it in IMAX. Then, for the sound, see it in Dolby. But this movie, I can't. It's just one of the greatest movies ever made. And I cannot wait for Dune Messiah. Because this isn't the end. Jamis lives. Okie dokie.